Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's episode of Carefulist, the podcast. I'm Katie Christophic, founder of The Carefulist. And today we are welcoming Kelly Ellis, who is a caregiver to her son who has type 1 diabetes. Welcome to the show, Kelly.
Thank you. Thank you for including diabetes and thank you for including me as
Yeah.
well. It's great to be here.
Yeah. And so just a quick little background. Kelly and I grew up together and we are connected on Facebook. And so I have been privy to her journey, and she was gracious enough to share her journey with everyone. So let's start from the very beginning and how you ended up knowing that this is the path you're on.
And I think, just to sort of put it into perspective, I think that a lot of families end up in very similar timelines that we were put in. It was not something that we had planned on. It was a very sudden diagnosis that sort of led us on this path. So we don't, just to kind of put it into perspective with type 1 diabetes in our family, we don't have anybody on either side of our family that has type 1. And so, although we were seeing some signs and symptoms, we always chalked them up to just normal developmental growth, especially everything as compared to maybe other siblings that are within the family. So, a lot was being compared to our oldest child who does not have diabetes. And, we kind of brushed everything off. But it was sudden. July 2021, we found ourselves at an urgent care with a possible UTI, which is very hard to basically diagnose in children, especially male children. So they did a urine sample. The doctor came in with about 3 other nurses, which was interesting. And they told us that there was no bacteria in his urine, that there was ample amounts of sugar. And so we were whisked away at 8:30 on a Saturday morning to a children's hospital, who took us right back, and that basically started our journey. Obviously, when you're at an urgent care, they don't give you a diagnosis. So they tell you something like, we are suspecting. And
Mhm.
that's when everything changed. We started questioning, maybe they're wrong. We don't have anybody in our family. Isn't this something that's, sort of genetic, hereditary? And so, yeah, that's basically how this all started. Little did we know that it would take us pretty much 4 years to get where we are today. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
So when you got to the hospital and they started running tests and all of that, what was the moment? What was the conversation like where they came and said, "This is what you're facing"?
Well, and then Cooper at that time, who is our type 1 diabetic, he was 6, about to turn 7. So he was pretty young. Coming out of kindergarten, it was the summer before first grade. And with my teacher background, I was very aware that he was watching our reactions, right? So I feel like it's a different diagnosis with a child than it
Mm.
is with an adult.
Yeah.
And so I was trying to put on this face of, we're okay, everything's okay. When in the back of my mind, I had no idea where this was going to lead.
Hmm.
And we were scared, frankly, because we weren't sure who we were going to be able to fall back on for support or guidance. Because, an endocrinologist, the doctor that deals with diabetes, doesn't live with us. And,
Right.
knew that this was going to be decisions every second of every day. But every time a doctor would come in and tell us, this is what we think is happening, we're going to run some more tests, we need to start insulin pretty much immediately, he would look toward us every single time. And so
Yeah.
I just kept reassuring and repeating, what was happening. But there was a lot of grief immediately, and a different kind of grief of losing someone, right? Like, it was grieving the life that we used to have and
Hmm.
how that was going to change and what that was going to look like going forward.
Yeah.
So there was a lot of silence and a lot of listening and a lot of doctors. The one good thing is we live in Denver and we have a pretty large community for type 1 diabetes that is affiliated with the Children's Hospital.
Hmm.
Um, I didn't know that we wouldn't be using them for very long, but that initial diagnosis and that initial crash course of where this was headed and what we were going to be responsible for was right there. You know,
Hmm.
somebody from the clinic came over immediately and was like introducing themselves. I'm the, endo that's on call. You're in really good hands. But what was sort of different for us that I'm realizing from other families and other diagnosis stories, we went home. A lot of people are sent to the NICU and they stay there until, levels start to kind of balance themselves out. But they told us he would be getting a shot of insulin that would be long acting. So it would be like a slow release over a 24-hour period, and that they would be sending us home because it was a Saturday. It wasn't technically, a work day of the week. And
Hmm.
then telling my friends that I knew had experiences with type 1 diabetes and who were adult type 1 diabetics, they could not believe that. They were like, no, 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 you have to go back to the hospital. And I kept thinking, well, no, they're telling us like we're going home. And they're like, no, you can't go home. So there was some weird miscommunication between those, two aspects. But
Yeah.
so that was sort of different for us. We ended up leaving that Saturday after about 6 hours at the hospital. And then we had to come back Sunday. They gave us a time. We walked into the ER. He pulled his sleeve up and they gave him a second long acting shot. Those two shots were going to help manage his number and
Hmm.
get us to Monday, which turned into a crash course of, I think we had 2 or 3 days of like all day meetings on where we were headed and basically
Yeah.
teaching us how to become a caregiver. So,
Wow.
yeah.
I am so glad that you talked about the grief aspect of it because life changes with a diagnosis, whether it's type 1 or cancer or Parkinson's, like whatever, chronic illness. And there is the loss of life before. And then there's the grief of, well, this is the path we thought we were on.
Yeah.
And now we're not. And now our son's life looks very different. And to try to process all of that and then have to spend days learning how to take care of him in this new capacity, I cannot imagine the amount of overwhelm that you experienced.
Well, and I can't, I don't have much comparison to other chronic illnesses. A lot of times if you have, if you're having a deficiency with thyroid or some other autoimmune, there is somewhat of an easy fix. You'll take this pill, we'll slightly
Mhm.
adjust it every morning, 8 a.m., you're good to go.
Mhm.
With type 1 diabetes, there is no rule book on what he will need. And Cooper, now at age 11, in comparison to another age 11 type 1 diabetic, maybe let's just say male, are drastically different. So
Mhm.
you get support from an endocrinologist, but they can't make decisions for you. And I realized that pretty quickly. Hey, we're seeing this. What do we do? What do you think we should do? What? Like a week
I didn't
ago,
go to
I
medical
wasn't
school,
doing
you
this.
did.
Yeah. And so I realized pretty quick, like, you're alone and
Yeah.
you're isolated and you are set to figure it out on your own. And that can be quite a challenge,
Yeah.
especially among parents, right? So I walked away from teaching years ago, which who knew that that was going to put me in a really good place to really support Cooper.
Mhm.
But even troubleshooting and trying to figure out what we're going to do and going to my husband, Cooper's father, was a challenge because I
Mhm.
would feel so strongly about something and he would be getting snippets of it and he would feel strongly about something and we had to kind of figure out where our placement was in this whole thing because he
Yeah.
wanted to help but he doesn't want to overstep what I've already been working on for the last 20 hours. And of course Cooper wasn't textbook in anything, and so that kind of put us with a lot of strain among our family dynamic. Plus, we have another child who's older
Yeah.
and needs our attention, but every waking second was so focused on Cooper and trying to help him, that balance is
Yeah.
difficult. Is really difficult. And I did realize that other caregivers, maybe in other aspects of life, were the most forgiving in anything we were dealing with. They understood that this can be time consuming and it's not consistent. Every day was going to bring something new. So celebrate the wins and manage the days that just don't seem to be going so well. And I think I found myself leaning on other caregivers that weren't always diabetic related, but they could at least understand, absorb, and find the right thing to maybe say back to us, until we got our feet on the ground and could figure out where we were headed.
Yeah. It's one of my favorite sayings is there's no such thing as perfection in caregiving because there is nothing that will, pardon me, humble you faster than
Yeah,
becoming a caregiver.
right,
And, you have to let go of whatever mistake you made yesterday and try again today and know that there's going to be a mistake somewhere down the road. It happens and you correct it the best you can and you keep moving forward.
right, right. I did also realize too, and I mean, people always try to correct me when I say this, but it's real. I thought I was a really strong person, like bulletproof, like solid. I'm a very optimistic person. I don't find myself in dark corners, but weeks after diagnosis, and I'm sitting in the corner of a closet crying, not to get emotional about it, but crying and not wanting Cooper to see that, I realized pretty quick
Yeah.
I was solid and I was grounded and I was strong and courageous when there weren't very many things at play.
Mm.
And now that this involved a child that, I thought with an education background, I would be totally prepared for this. This is perfect, right? I'm
Yeah.
used to taking all these situations in a classroom and
Hmm.
managing it all. But
Yeah.
this was different. And I found out pretty quickly, okay, I may not be as strong as I thought I was. And that was okay to say. I'm not saying that to downplay the person that I am, but I think that was a part of our journey is that I had to realize I'm going to fail, right?
Hmm.
I'm going to let him down. He's going to get upset with me because all of his other friends are out running around and we're finger poking. We're treating a low. He's sitting next to me, and it may not be what he wants at that
Hmm.
particular moment, but we're going to get there and it will get better. That is a common phrase that type 1 diabetics who have been managing diabetes for decades, whether it be themselves or they were caregivers, every single time in a moment where maybe you don't have an answer for somebody who, is newly diagnosed and they're desperate for help,
Hmm.
very many times somebody would say, it will get easier, I promise. And that
Yes.
is a line I use so frequently in any situation now because it's true. It may not be a quick fix, maybe like a bacterial infection where they're going to give you an antibiotic and in 2 weeks everything's peachy keen again. It may
Hmm.
not be like that, but it will get better. And in the grand scheme of things, 4 years in a lifetime that it took us to get to this point, gosh, is so worth it.
Yeah.
In the end, you just have to be patient. It will get
Right.
better. Keep asking questions, keep talking to the people around you, keep finding those support groups, those people who really truly want to listen. I will say, I think we realized pretty quickly the family members and the friends that really, really cared about our family, those people stuck with us. And the
Yep.
others that didn't find time or the ability to kind of listen to us complain
Hmm.
frequently, they sort of got lost in it all. And I'm okay with that. In
Yeah.
the end, we have to take care of ourselves. And if I'm not 100% for Cooper, then Cooper can't be 100% for him. And that was so important. And I honestly think my educational background and teaching was a big part of that, learning that development is a journey, not a sprint. So.
Right. Yeah. Well, and you touched on something that is so key. And it seems like it doesn't matter what the diagnosis is. When there's a diagnosis, there are the people who stick with you and there are the people who don't. And that can be painful in and of itself when you thought that there were certain people who would show up for you who, for one reason or another, don't have the capacity or whatever.
Right.
They are
Right.
no longer there for you. But making that decision to let it go and
Yeah.
show up the way you know you need to, it's a really hard lesson to learn, but it's super important because then it just sort of steels you to keep going forward.
Right. Right. Yeah. And we had to, I always told my husband, we have to like find a way that this works for us. I think when type 1 diabetic children were diagnosed with as families, years ago, decades ago, one of the statistics they would throw out at that diagnosis appointment, which I can imagine looked drastically different than what we had 4 years ago, was the percentage of husband and wives that don't make it. And I would
Yeah.
imagine that that statistic is there for any caregiver. But it really taught us pretty quickly we've got to figure out a way that we can support each other or this will not work.
Mhm.
And I can't imagine having to shuffle Cooper back and forth. I mean, it's a thing. I'm not saying that it's not impossible, but I can't imagine having to send him in somebody else's care where I'm not, necessarily involved. And so we really quickly put ourselves first. And that has meant, because he was so difficult with the diagnosis and management, um, that has kept us from date nights. That has kept us from me traveling with him, maybe to work conferences like we used to do. We used to use those as our time away from kids so we could focus on ourselves.
Mhm.
And we just realized pretty quickly at some point he will be self managing and we won't really be a part of the picture. We'll get
Mhm.
back to us, take care of ourselves, do what we can for each other. But at some point, we'll get back to what we used to be if we're just a little bit patient. And I'd say we're getting closer and closer to that, obviously. But
Yeah.
yeah, so
You've alluded to Cooper being a difficult case and not following the typical type 1 trajectory. Can you talk about some of the other influencing factors on why his experience has been more challenging and not so straightforward?
sure. So there are millions of diabetics, type 1 diabetics, that have been diagnosed. I believe in the US alone, I think it's like 1 point something, and that can be children or adults. Type 1 diabetes, I technically have two antibodies. I could become a type 1 diabetic before I leave this earth. Hopefully not, but I have that ability. It's an autoimmune thing. It can show up when it wants if my immune system decides it wants to obviously attack my own body. Um, but we realized pretty quickly he was different. Um, and to be honest with you, even up until today, I think I have only truly ever met two other people like him.
Mm,
Out of all of these families and parents and type 1 diabetics that we knew previously, that we have met along the journey, nobody seems to be like him. After Cooper was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, about a year into it, he would go days without needing insulin, and we wouldn't run any insulin.
mhm,
And for somebody who doesn't receive insulin, you will end up with sugar in your urine. So automatically they would say, if he doesn't need insulin, test his urine, which is frequent if,
mhm.
for some reason insulin is blocked from the body absorbing. And so every time we would test, he would never have any sugar in his urine. It would come back nothing, zero, nothing, nothing, nothing. But I'd be like, well, how can we go 3 days without needing insulin? But right, like already an endocrinologist would say, I don't know. I have no idea. So then they started backtracking and saying, okay, well, maybe his pancreas is hanging on. Maybe he has a couple cells in his pancreas that are still producing insulin because he's getting insulin or he's getting what he needs from somewhere. We just can't
Mhm.
quite figure out. Okay, they call that the honeymoon period because once somebody is diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, your pancreas will kick in again and try to help. but eventually the immune system takes over the whole thing and everything shuts down. I would say on average, the most that a pancreas will hang on for most diabetics when they're first diagnosed is about a month. So
Mm.
we're a year in.
Yeah.
It's not impossible. They've had cases where the pancreas hangs on for up to 13 years, but it's like rare, and it's,
Wow.
not very common. And
Mhm.
so every time we would get an answer like that, I just wasn't buying it. I just thought, yeah, I get it. I get what you're saying. We don't have any ketones, which is great. That's what they call sugar in the urine. But something's not right. We had asked 3 different endocrinologists at this world-renowned diabetic clinic that's affiliated with our children's hospital. And they kept saying, nope, we tested him for everything at diagnosis. We don't test, every 6 months. We'll consider testing at the year mark, but possibly 2 years out. And I kept saying, I know, but I'm talking to other families who are seeing such drastic changes in his blood sugars, and they're wondering if something like a gluten allergy is affecting him. And they kept saying, nope, we tested him, we tested him. Well, after we got to be quite impossible to manage, I decided we need to go somewhere else. If you're not getting what you need at said place, get a second opinion, a third opinion, a fourth opinion. Keep trying to find the answer. Meanwhile, I'm checking every research paper that's online. I'm at Johns Hopkins. I'm at CHOP in Philadelphia because they have one of the best diabetic clinics in the world. I'm looking in Boston because that's where the first diabetic clinic. I'm reading up on as much as I can, and I'm finding a correlation between blood sugars and celiac.
Mhm.
So I call this new endocrinologist. We have, I think, 3 here in Denver, and most of it is outshone by that one that's at the Children's Hospital. And mind you, they're very good. If you are just dealing with type 1 diabetes, they're fantastic. Our crash course was great. We learned a ton, but we needed more of a personalized experience. And so we needed
Yeah.
to go smaller. And so we ended up switching to another endocrinologist, and we go in for our very first consult. And I'm telling her what's happening. Immediately, she says, let's run the blood work. I mean, finding out whether you're celiac or not is a blood test. It's very easy. You used to have to get a scope, and they needed to check out the stomach lining, the gut, and everything. But the blood test is really reliable now, and it's actually getting better and better. I think there's a new blood test now out that's even more reliable, which is great. And so she draws blood, sends it out. We're at a birthday party. Fast forward after her appointment, we're at a birthday party. They're getting ready to serve pizza. I kid you not. Sometimes I laugh at how I find myself in these situations. And my phone rings. And it's a Saturday. And I pick up, and it's our new endocrinologist. And she's like, Kelly, you're never going to believe this. He's celiac, which at this point I had kind of known. The difference is a lot of celiacs have a lot of digestive issues. It's also an autoimmune. It's the body freaking out over gluten. And he's getting ready to put this pizza in his mouth. And I'm like, do I say, stop?
Right.
Like, no, we think you're celiac. But real quick, I was calmed down and thought to myself, okay, one extra slice of pizza is probably not going to make or break what's happening at this point. But as soon as we get home, we're starting gluten-free diet. We're starting there. What's different about Cooper, though, is this. Most celiacs have the digestive, portion of it, and they are sick, flu-like symptoms for up to a week after they are gluten. Many of them realize pretty quickly that they have a gluten allergy because of those symptoms. Cooper only ever had stomach cramping. I will say early on, he would throw up with certain foods, but it still wasn't very obvious that it was a definite celiac connection. That did get better, but he would just get some stomach cramping, nothing crazy. What affects him the most from gluten are his blood sugars. His blood sugars go crazy when he digests gluten, to the point where he'll start out, let's just say he's starting out with a blood sugar at 100, which is really good for somebody who's not a type 1 diabetic. And he would eat gluten. Within 6 hours, we would see lows. And I'll tell you why that happens, or what we have figured out. And basically, I've figured this out on my own with the help of a GI, but nobody really walked us in the direction. But we would see lows that would then be followed by highs. And it would happen frequently. And he would just like skyrocket up, down, up, down, really difficult to manage. And I just didn't know what to make of that because most
Mhm.
celiacs don't have that problem. No, our A1C is super low. No, we don't have any issues with that. Ours is solely digestion. Well, not for
Yeah.
us. Our biggest problem is that blood sugar. So what happens is his stomach lining freaks out. The minute that it is gluten, it shuts down. It what it would be a good comparison for this is a stomach virus. So if
Mm.
you pick up a stomach bug and vomiting starts, your stomach lining, your digestive tract will stop absorbing what is currently in the body because it's freaked out that there's, foreign bacteria, what's happening. So everything shuts down. So you stick to the brat diet, you stick to things like that. Gluten does the same thing for him. The
Mm.
minute his body detects gluten, his digestive tract shuts down, he stops absorbing. Well, if you're not absorbing carbs, you need very little insulin.
Yeah.
That was the connection all along. So, yes, although honeymooning made sense in the beginning, after a good year to a year and a half, we pretty quickly realized this isn't his pancreas, this is something else. So now, if he is gluten and we're running large amounts of insulin and his stomach shuts down, he will immediately not need insulin, which becomes super dangerous
Mhm.
because I'm giving him upwards of 40 units of insulin a day. When he's gluten, he needs less than 5. So making that adjustment is virtually impossible.
Right.
And so in the beginning, we found ourselves like chasing lows all the time, to then which in turn to high. And so there were just so many variables. So this just added another variable for him. I think the reason the diabetic clinic was not quite understanding what was going on is because this is not very common. And like I said, I have found one or two other families in very similar situations, but most celiacs don't act that way. But it probably took us two years, 2 years to basically figure that out and have like a plan for, what was important for him. So for Cooper, a very strict gluten-free diet is everything because it
Mhm.
keeps his body functioning the way that it's supposed to. It keeps insulin running the way it's supposed to. And it keeps him safe because gluten for him is a very dangerous, situation because we're using insulin and we are, creating the scenario. We don't get help from the liver, like a normal functioning body would. The liver will come in and save low blood sugars, but he doesn't get that help. And so we have to do that manipulation. And that put us and him in, some very serious situations. And I just couldn't get an endocrinologist to take what we were seeing seriously. And so this new endocrinologist right away was like, yep, it's celiac. You need to make sure he's gluten free, and strict gluten free,
Mm.
which comes with a whole other set of rules, sadly.
Yeah.
But yeah, so we
Yeah.
ended up with two diagnoses then. We ended up with type 1 and celiac. And one thing we know looking toward the future is celiac, type 1, and thyroid tend to run together.
Mm.
There is a really good chance down the road that his immune system will also attack his thyroid. And then he will most likely be put on medication when that happens. For right now, it's functioning. And that one will be a little bit easier to diagnose, but he's checked every year, I think, for certain screenings, and that's one of them. So, when we speak about being alone and not having many resources, we would go to families and friends who were diabetics. And Cooper is one of 5 diabetics in his elementary school of
Mhm.
500 students, which is unusual in itself. And so I found myself constantly asking other moms and other caregivers, questions. And every time it would be like, nah, I don't know what that is. That's different. That's unusual. We're not like that, and so you
Yeah.
just kind of had to slowly figure out what was going on with him and make adjustments and hope that something stuck. And it finally did. So we're in a much better position now than we've ever been.
Yeah. Well, I'm so glad to hear that. And you've mentioned his elementary school and other kids being diabetic. So, what is the relationship like with school? And he's at that age where there are class parties and things like that. And I know that that is also a struggle. So, I would love to hear about the school nurse and how that relationship goes. And then, For other people listening who don't necessarily understand type 1 diabetes in particular, why it's important to not make class parties all about food and all that kind of stuff.
Well, and being from the East Coast and moving
Mhm.
west, things are different. I only taught in an education system in the East Coast, in the Northeast, and so my experience was there. When we left Pennsylvania, districts in the area were already eliminating food parties. Taking into consideration, we have a lot of allergies just in general and rise as we get better and better at diagnosing things. And so school parties kind of became a thing of the past. In the district in which I taught, it wasn't a thing. We did very little food incentives, focused on a lot of other ways of, kind of having fun days and keeping the class, on track. So when we came out here, right after Cooper was diagnosed, he was going into first grade, and we had already had an older child go through the system. And I volunteered, like a lot of moms like to volunteer, and yeah, but I didn't really pay attention to much of what was happening.
Mhm.
But come Christmas time, um, there were some fairly large parties, endless amounts of food, and I mean, I know not everybody carb counts, but I mean, if he were to have participated that first year after diagnosis, if he wanted to, full blown eat everything that shows up, we would have been hitting anywhere from 500 to 600 carbs easy, which is way more than a meal should be anyway. The reason it's difficult for a type 1 diabetic, especially when you have a caregiver who's not there assisting, because I have to communicate with him some way or another. So it ends up either being through the school nurse, which I'll speak of her then. She was our lifesaver, 100%. Um, and now I text message him. So I am able
Mhm.
to text message back and forth, which that in itself was a challenge at the beginning, especially when they're so little, and just
Yeah.
forming sentences and making sure that he understood what I said, especially because, too much insulin wouldn't be good, too little insulin, not good. And, so there was a lot of checking, a lot of communication, a lot of interruption in the classroom,
Mhm.
really. But Cooper wears a pump, and so he gets insulin throughout the day frequently. He
Mhm.
has settings for breakfast, for lunch, for dinner. We know several things with type 1 diabetes. Breakfast is the most forgiving because that sleep between 3 and 6 a.m. needs very little insulin. So you tend to be behind. So the minute you start eating, you need a lot more insulin for breakfast. So breakfast, most forgiving. Lunch depends on recess. When does recess fall? This year, they've switched recess to be before lunch, which has been a nightmare to manage. Um, and then, dinner, are you catching up from the day? Did you not need a lot? So there's a lot of variables that go into it. What are you eating? How does this typically affect him? This and that, whatever. So when Cooper gets up and eats breakfast, I'm taking into consideration, okay, the last few days he's needed a good amount of insulin. So we're going to make sure we get ahead of it. Then I know I have about 90 minutes for that insulin to really kick in and to cover what he has eaten. So let's say that's 9 a.m. Now, 9 a.m., the class wants to throw a party, and this is going to involve cinnamon buns.
Mhm.
And a couple things that come into play because he is celiac. He most likely cannot participate because buying large quantities of cinnamon buns from a grocery store or a local establishment, they're not going to be gluten free. I mean, we all know that.
Mhm.
And so all of that has to be taken into consideration. He's coming down off of breakfast. We're now going to feed him. I'm now going to give him more insulin, and that's going to take 90 minutes to wear off. But he's going to recess 30 minutes in. That recess is going to cover some of those carbs. Well, how many carbs is that going to cover? I don't know. Is he going to run? Is he going to swing? Are they going to socialize in the corner and not be active at all? So is he dehydrated? Is he hydrated? We're going to move that insulin through his body a lot quicker. There are so many countless variables, some of which we don't even consider, right? Is he growing?
Yeah.
Is he sick? All of that involves hormones. Hormones include glucose. Glucose is carbs. Insulin has to cover for that. Your pancreas is the most underappreciated organ in the body. I cannot say that enough. It is working
Yeah.
constantly to keep that number at 100. And you would think manipulating that on my end would be somewhat easy. It's not. It's not at all. We have a
Mhm.
range in which we try to stay in, but there are some times where you're just like, don't know. This is the same breakfast we have eaten all week. you would think we should be able to dose the same amount and pretty much land within that range. Doesn't always happen.
Yeah.
And so it just adds more variables and more consideration, right? And let's say we screw up, and that's going to happen. We talked about that. I'm going to fail. Well, fail.
Hmm.
Breakfast did not go so well. I had to text message him. We're now giving more insulin. Now we have too much insulin. And now we're going out to recess. Once you get off of that really nice range of just kind of floating in the numbers that are appropriate for a type 1 diabetic, the minute you get off of that track, it is really hard to get back. And it is really hard to get back if he's not sitting here with me and I can't like microdose or give him a little bit to kind of slow things. And many type 1 diabetic families do not like their kiddos to go above 225 as far as a blood sugar, because you start to lose the ability to focus. Your body wants to move because it wants to naturally drop that blood sugar, right? And so the teacher is giving her biggest lesson at that moment where he's climbing. Now he's 250, 275, because I didn't dose for those cinnamon rolls appropriately, right? Lots of sugar, lots of not great things. And now I want him to focus on long division, and he gets home and says, I don't even know what she said because I couldn't even focus. I got up, went to the bathroom, I tried to drink, right? He's all out of sorts. So changing a schedule, and they'll tell you in that first week of a crash course, if you can stick to a schedule, you'll be better off. Breakfast around the same time, lunch around the same time, dinner around the same time, so that you can get those settings on your pump to be appropriate for what he needs. And you'll obviously be, most likely to be more successful. But any of those additional things, especially, in a classroom, will only set him up to fail most of the time. So my husband and I constantly say the classroom is for learning, the cafeteria is for eating. If we can keep it that way, and most kids, don't even notice when there isn't food at a party, the better off we'll be. And I think if we want to be inclusive, I feel like we need to be inclusive all around. And that goes for anybody. And food really limits many students and situations. So,
Right. Yeah. And it's not just gluten, it's food allergies in general. There are people with allergies that you wouldn't expect. I mean, I have family members who are allergic to certain kinds of raw fruit. So, like, you bring in an apple and, they need an EpiPen. So it
healthy is
goes
not even always the best option. Right.
right. Yeah. Somebody's thinking, oh, well, I'll bring in the healthy stuff. Well, for my family member, an apple is no bueno.
Yeah. Well, and for an adult to say, hey, no big deal. We're doing a little potluck at lunch. That's fine. I brought a salad. I'll be okay. Explaining that, especially when he was younger, to a 6 and 7-year-old, that you cannot participate in the majority of this food party that is happening is much more difficult. I do have to say, and I do want to touch a little bit just on our nurse as well, but real quick, one of the things that a lot of endocrinologists will suggest is getting a counselor. So Cooper sees a therapist once a month to establish basically a rapport so that when he becomes a teenager, as we know, teenagers, and doesn't want to be a diabetic anymore, but he has to in order to survive, right? He doesn't want to wear his pump. We kind of get this relationship started so that he doesn't have to deal with me. He can go to his therapist, get a little bit of help. But the reason I'm bringing her up is going back to the school party thing. And she had asked, how is this year going? How's the teacher? Does the teacher seem supportive in all of this? And luckily, the teacher he has this year was a teacher that our oldest son, Jameson, had as well. And I absolutely adore her. And she said right off the bat, we'll be fine. So I was helping to plan our little fall party, and they were like, no food. And that was probably the second time that has happened in our entire elementary career. And this is his final year there, which is wonderful. But the therapist looked at me when I answered it and said, oh, I'm sure they were like, here comes Kelly. And here comes Kelly with all of her wants and all of her needs. And she looked right at me and said, good. A school building is a building that is supposed to be serving all of its students, not the easiest, not the ones that you see in the textbook of how things are supposed to be done. They're there to service you as a community member, member and offer so much support, I would hope that they would know your name, because if not, then technically you would be doing an injustice to Cooper. And I thought, there it is.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. And after being a teacher and being in situations like that, I'll never forget a student's mom came to me years ago and said, when I was teaching, my son was diagnosed ADHD and he doesn't like to take his meds. And I know you're probably going to say no, right? So I'm 23. I'm in my first teaching role. I had no idea that I was going to be a caregiver of some sort in the future as well. And
Mm-hmm.
she said, I know you're going to say no, which I don't even know how that became my decision on what happens in my classroom. But he would like to not take the meds and maybe come up with a plan of how he could be successful in your classroom. And it took me no less than 1 second to say, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
What can I do? And I
Yeah.
feel like, obviously, I was 23. I was going home to just myself and a dog, right? Like, I
Mhm.
was in a really good place in my life. I didn't have a lot of distractions. I wasn't overly exhausted, right? I think being
Mhm.
tired determines how we handle many situations. And we didn't
Yes.
sleep a lot at the beginning of this. And I feel like, but how, by me saying that, he went the whole year without taking an ADHD med, was super successful because
Mhm.
knowledge and understanding content was not the problem. Oh, he did a lot of laps around the room. I had a lot of stations where he could, fidget spinners before they were even a thing, that he
Yeah.
could, be successful. But the fact that I have had teachers in our past that have told us, I know you want Cooper to have a water bottle on his desk, but we keep them over there on top of the cubbies. And I'm like, well, he's 6 and I want him to get bored at some point, because that's going to happen in a first grade classroom. Look at that water and think, oh, I'm going to drink this water, because water for a type 1 diabetic is honestly like free insulin. Because when the
Yeah.
body's hydrated, everything works better. It can help lower blood sugars, ironically. When you're hydrated, you can move insulin throughout the body a lot easier. And so, like, I wanted, because I wasn't there, to say to him, make sure you're drinking. Okay, by 10 o'clock, you need to finish, your little thermos of water. He would look at it and just drink it. And he was
Right.
very good at that. And I thought, this is perfect. But I had a teacher who told me that she didn't want it to have it on his desk. And I thought, that's not your decision. This is an endocrinologist and our family's
Right.
decision on what's best for him, especially because he was so difficult to manage. So I don't think that I'll ever understand that. But our experiences, have changed. This is a fantastic year. His teacher this year is absolutely wonderful. And I will say, if I didn't have our school nurse to help, we
Mhm.
would be in a much different position, because in a situation like that with his water bottle, she walked into the room and said to the teacher, he has a 504 plan. He has things in place for troubleshooting wonky numbers. And one of them is that he is allowed to have a liquid on his desk. It doesn't even have to be water, because when we look at Propels and Gatorades and things like that, Gatorade Zero, obviously, there's a lot of electrolytes in there which help with hydration, and that is so uber important for any diabetic. But
Mhm.
I honestly don't think that we would be where we are without our school nurse. She is fantastic, and just so reasonable and so willing to help when we were just all over the place. I mean, to kind of put it into perspective, because obviously you don't know what happens in somebody's life or in any situation until you experience it, right? And then you
Right.
find those similarities and being able to relate with somebody else. Cooper used to have to finger poke, I bet in the beginning, upwards of 20 times a day. Now he wears a CGM, and so we know his number, but when he was being gluten, the Dexcom could not keep up because his
Mhm.
numbers were so crazy, rising and falling, rising and falling. It would just give up. It would eliminate things and just try to show a number. And so I would often have to say, you got to go finger poke. I don't know what's going on. I don't know what your number is. Down to once, twice a week sometimes. So 20 times a day to practically nothing. I mean, he was in the nurse's office all the time. She could
Yeah.
have easily said, this is crazy. He needs to stay in the classroom. Yeah, 100% agree, but it wasn't safe.
Mhm.
And so, as you know, in any caregiver position, a break from this is everything when it is
Yes.
24/7. I just didn't want to look at a blood sugar. I didn't want to troubleshoot. And she allows me to get my hair done, to go to a dental appointment. Who knew dental appointments were going to be so great as I aged, and just not think about him for 5 seconds. Because
Right.
if I'm not at 100%, like I said in the beginning, then I can't be there for him either. So
Right.
she's been everything. She's been absolutely everything.
Oh,
Yeah.
I'm so glad that you have someone who's so supportive like that. So while we're thinking about support and information, I know you found some resources throughout your journey that have been really helpful for you. And for anybody who's listening and maybe just starting in their T1D journey, where would you recommend they go for some additional information?
Yep. So pretty early on, we had a couple caregiver friends that we had just met, along the way and pretty quickly, who recommended the Juice Box podcast. Ironically, it's called the Juice Box because a lot of people use that to treat lows. And I will say you can post freely, you can share your thoughts, you can ask for advice, you can ask for help. It started around 16,000 members when I first joined in 2021, and it's well over 60,000 members at this point. And that's on Facebook alone. But when we would get stuck, that's when I would post. And in all honesty, I posted, we're having a lot of difficulty with management. And a mom, one of the two who ended up being our saving grace, was like, have you looked into celiac disease? And I'm like, yeah, well, he was tested. Well, it can come on at any time. It can be a sudden diagnosis, just like anything else. And sometimes when you get one diagnosis, others appear later.
Mhm.
But it was her comment that pushed me in the direction of maybe we're dealing with something that an endocrinologist just isn't seeing on a graph or a snippet or a 5-minute conversation at our 3-month appointment every 3 months.
Yeah.
So the Juice Box podcast has been everything. I don't post as much anymore, but I do look for maybe other families who have similar situations, like this is just
Mhm.
isn't making sense. What our nutritionist told us that first week, fat, protein, carbs, and how all of that plays a role in how much insulin you need per meal. Yeah, but none of this adds up. Now I look to comment. But that podcast was a huge saving grace. Um, Facebook alone. So the minute I posted Cooper's diagnosis, I had a high school friend reach out and told me that her brother, Steve Maciejewski, if you know who they are, she said, you need to message him right now. Because they had just gone through it. They had just gone through a diagnosis with their son during COVID of all times. And so Steve and I talk daily. And we both have significant others who want to basically just fix the problem and ignore it. And Steve and I like to work through things. And so
Mhm.
we have become such a support for each other in just venting, just saying, this doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
Like, what do you suggest? What do you think? What do you see? So finding that person that has a very similar management style, I honestly think is key.
Mhm.
Um, and ironically, like with type 1, at least, there are a lot of professional athletes who have used their forearm for good. And that's a big deal. Cooper ended
Yeah.
up at a type 1 diabetic football camp in June. Um, Ironically, his initial principal, when he was diagnosed, he's no longer in our building. Son played for the Jacksonville Jaguars, and he's a type 1 diabetic. And so it was real cool to just kind of have that word of mouth connection. And now Chad does all of these diabetic camps and, tries to help. So finding that. I also think a sleepaway camp at some point. We weren't quite ready for that because he was so difficult to manage. But I think in high school, I'm going to try to look for something along the lines of that. There are many diabetics who suggest a sleepaway camp. So I think that's also
Yeah.
good. And just finding a connection. We use Tandem
Mhm.
for diabetes for all of our management needs, and they have clinicians on staff. And so when we were troubleshooting the device that is inserted into his skin to deliver insulin into the body, they offer so many different options of that. So talking
Mhm.
to a clinician this summer and realizing that we probably didn't have what was best for him, you can call and pretty much get on the phone with a registered nurse or a diabetes educator within minutes. Their customer service is
Wow.
fantastic. So don't be afraid to reach out for things like that. But in all honesty, a lot of it is trial and error. and then finding that support group who can kind of support you through that troubleshooting and things like that. But the internet and social media and all of that has really been a saving grace in connection, for us and for me, and staying sane through all of it. So,
Well, and I don't want to end the conversation without talking about Jameson, your firstborn, because he has stepped up in the hero role of the big brother more
yeah.
than once, consistently. And so I know he participated in some research. So if you can talk a little bit about that, just to share,
That's
what's
true.
happening behind the scenes as they're trying to make management of T1D easier and better.
Right, right. And we do have another son. That is sometimes really hard to imagine, especially because Jameson's so easy and so independent. So Cooper would have been diagnosed around age 6, and that means Jameson is 3 years older. So he was 9, so still technically in elementary school. Because we ended up at the Children's Hospital, there is actually an organization called TrialNet, who is all over the nation. I don't know about world, but definitely within the US. And once somebody in your family is diagnosed, they quickly recommend that you all get screened. It's a simple blood test, and they're looking for antibodies. And the easiest way, or the easiest analogy I can think of, is before the COVID vaccine, when we were going through COVID, and you wanted to know if you had it. Did I end up having it? Was I sick from it? You used to be able to test for those antibodies, and they could say prior to the vaccine, yes, you have definitely had COVID type of thing. So they're looking for very similar things. There are, I believe, 5 different markers that they are looking for. So if you have had a virus that likes to trick the immune system into thinking that all is not so great, it's very similar to the cell makeup that produces insulin within the pancreas. And my husband came back with no markers. So he has 0 antibodies for type 1 diabetes. I did tell you earlier, I have 2 of the 5. With each new decade that I get into, I don't know if that's the right way to say it, but I'm in my 40s. Once I then make my way into my 50s, my chances of becoming type 1 lessen. And they do lessen drastically. If you can make it out of childhood, the odds are in your favor. But as we all know, you only need 1% to technically be diagnosed with something. On that Juicebox podcast recently, somebody was diagnosed at age 73, type 1 diabetes. And
Oh my
her
gosh.
whole little podcast thing was just fascinating. I can't imagine being in my 70s and being like, I mean, we have pumps and everything now. It's fantastic. But so that TrialNet looks for those markers. I ended up with 2 antibodies. Jameson, as a direct correlation of a sibling, right?
Mhm.
So being from the same 2 parents, Jameson came back with 0 antibodies, and that is rare. Usually, if a child is diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, most of their siblings will have at least 1 antibody. That does not mean that they will become type 1 diabetic, but they should at least have 1, especially the younger they are. And with
Yeah.
Jameson being older, so he was still 3 years ahead. Well, the minute that test result came back, my phone started ringing off the hook. From universities all over the nation. You can't even imagine what they were asking Jameson to do. Now, luckily, it came with a little compensation, and so he was all on board for some of that. I do have to say that. But here, he participated locally. If you remember, and anybody who knows with pregnancy, you go in for your sugar screening, and you have to
Yep.
down that orange drink or whatever flavor you choose, and then you go in and they draw blood to make sure that you're being able to keep up, and we can steer clear of gestational diabetes. He did something very similar. And I have some pictures that I posted online of him doing it. He had to drink the drink, which in the beginning, like everybody says, this isn't too bad, and by the end of it, it's so much sugar that you're like, I don't know if I can, swallow the
Yeah.
last gulp. They then followed him for an hour after drinking that, and they tested his blood sugar every 15 minutes. They wanted to know how he had gotten this far without any antibodies. What was different that
Hmm.
Cooper wasn't able to, have that same path? That does
Yeah.
not mean that at some point Jameson will get antibodies. He could very well become a diabetic in his lifetime. But they're looking to study bodies of siblings that have
Hmm.
type 1 diabetic, brothers and sisters, and to figure out what made him so different that allowed him to successfully get to this point. I mean, anywhere from, and I don't know if I really want to say this, but I mean, they were University of Miami called and wanted to know if we could do a poop smear and send it in the mail down, because they wanted to see like what's different. We know how the diabetic makeup looks, and we know how that the body
Yeah.
surrenders to the immune system. But what was Jameson doing? So he did an MRI following that. They
Mhm.
do like a little contrast and everything, and I don't even know exactly what they're looking for, but he did the MRI and he did the drink with the blood draw. They do that twice in a 1 year time frame.
Okay.
You can be retested for the antibodies. TrialNet will only pay for it one time, but
Mhm.
he could do it again if he wanted to. If he still came up with zero antibodies, I would be curious to see if they would want to kind of follow him for a year again. It's nothing like super crazy. It's blood draws, it's the MRI. They're looking at the pancreas and the liver kind of working together. And we don't really get like a conclusive thing from it. He just becomes
Mhm.
a part of the study. He becomes a part of the
Yeah.
statistics. And then in future years, they have cases to look back on, so on and so forth. But I didn't want to force him into doing anything.
Sure.
You see some of these stories of a sibling can save another sibling's life and stuff. And so I obviously let it up to him, and I explained to him that he's rare, technically, and it could be super helpful, in the science and the medical research community. And as soon as he heard that, he said, absolutely. And I told him, I said, can you imagine if there was something in your makeup that kind of led us down the path on how we can prolong the diagnosis of type 1, which seems to be all the focus at this point. Um,
Yeah.
because once you're screened, if he would have had antibodies, they will put you in stages of becoming a type 1.
Mm.
And so a certain number of antibodies put you in stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, and they now have medication to help support the pancreas and to encourage beta cell growth, which is the cell that produces insulin, so that they can prolong. So now the idea is we may not find a cure,
Mhm.
but if we can put off your diagnosis, maybe indefinitely, maybe
Yeah.
that's the route we go instead of trying to necessarily, find a cure. And I think one of the biggest misconceptions with type 1, because a lot of people, including myself in the beginning, could not understand. I mean, obviously, there's millions of diabetics as well, but why we couldn't just do a pancreas transplant. And the whole reason behind all of that is it's your immune system that is causing
Mhm.
the problem. So
Yeah.
even if we were to remove his pancreas, put in a new pancreas, and that pancreas is now reproducing the beta cell, which is going to then create insulin, his immune system would catch on and
Mhm.
eventually we'd be back to square one, which is why stem cell and all of that became such a thing, is because if we could reset the immune system, if we
Right.
could calm it down and allow the pancreas to function, that gives us more time. And there's so much happening between stem cell and different types of interventions that would support the pancreas and encourage beta cell growth. So we're definitely on the brink of something big. They have said for decades, maybe we'll find a cure, maybe we'll find a better way. I honestly think maybe in Cooper's lifetime, we may see some serious progress. Here's hoping.
Yeah. I think
Here's hoping.
so. And just the courage that it takes for Jameson to have done what he did and knowing that he has contributed in that way. And I can imagine from a scientific standpoint why people would be so interested to test him because he is that sibling of someone who is going through this. You can compare the genetic makeup and see what the differences are and how you can use those different stem cells to then come up with a treatment. Thank you so much for sharing your family story
Yeah.
and for all of the hard work that you put in to coming now to this place where he only has to poke his finger once or twice a week. I mean, that, if you really think about it, that is a huge accomplishment.
Yeah.
And it is all a testament to the care that you have given to him and the amount of fighting for what you know needs to happen for him. So
Yeah.
thank you for sharing your story with us.
Thank you for letting me. We greatly appreciate it.
Of
I know
course.
Cooper was excited to hear that this was happening too,
Oh,
because
well, thank you to
education is
Cooper.
everything. Education.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
and thank you to Cooper for being willing to share his very personal story. And I know that it will help other families and other kids who are being diagnosed. So, with that in mind, thank you to those of you who are at home or in the car or wherever you are for joining us today to listen to this story and learn more about type 1 diabetes. For additional resources, if you need them, there is, of course, things on our website, carefulist.com. And as Kelly mentioned, the Juicebox podcast on Facebook. Until next time, take care.